Okay, welcome to the debate. Imagine just for a moment a simple wooden fence.
Okay, I am picturing it.
Before you build it, anyone can walk right across an open green field. Anyone can pick an apple from a tree or, let their sheep eat the wild grass. The land is completely open.
Right. It is basically a shared space for the community.
Exactly. But the exact moment you hammer those wooden posts into the ground and string up a wire between them, well, everything changes. The space inside that fence becomes yours alone.
And the space outside becomes everywhere else. A fence is just wood and wire, but it totally rewrites human behavior.
It really does. It creates a space of belonging, but at the exact same time, it creates a space of strict exclusion. And that simple act of putting up a fence brings us right to the core of our discussion today. It sure does. Today we are exploring the historical transition of Britain, specifically the Enclosure movement, right?
Yeah, and how that domestic shift in farming connects directly to the rise of the British Empire. Our entire conversation today is driven by a truly fascinating video called The British Leap from Enclosure to Empire.
Oh, I loved it. It is such a brilliant piece of media.
It really is. It was actually designed by Hut Hut Hut. And the foundational ideas by Hut 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 that we will be unpacking today, they give us an incredible lens to look at how modern history was made.
It is a great starting point because the video forces us to look closely at a massive shift in how humans interact with the earth. It shows how changing the basic rules of land ownership shaped the entire modern world. To frame our disagreement today, we are looking at one central question. Did the creation of absolute property rights and the end of shared lands truly create the ultimate foundation for British wealth and global expansion?
Or does that view ignore the complex, difficult realities of the people who lost their shared rights in the process?
Right. And I will be clear about where I stand right from the jump. I believe the ideas presented in the video are right on the money. Strict legal ownership, returning to the Roman concept of the Dominus, was the essential spark that turned dead capital into surging wealth.
And I take a contrasting perspective. I believe that while property rights certainly created vast wealth for some people, celebrating the end of shared rights as true freedom ignores a harsh historical reality.
What reality is that?
That this system forced many regular people off their ancestral land just to survive.
Well, let's dig right into what Britain actually looked like before the Enclosure movement, because I think understanding the before is crucial to understanding why the after was so revolutionary.
Fair enough. Paint the picture for us.
So before the fences went up, rights to the land were, as the video points out, vague or shared. You had these massive open fields, but because nobody truly owned the field exclusively, nobody had the absolute authority to change it.
That is right. They operated on a system of common rights. You might have a village where dozens of families all had the right to graze their animals on the same pasture or gather firewood from the same forest.
But that shared system created a massive bottleneck for progress. I mean, if you wanted to try planting a new type of crop to keep the soil healthy, you couldn't just do it.
Right. You had to get the agreement of everyone in the village.
And stagnated. It wasn't producing nearly as much food as it could.
I see where you are going with this.
What the Enclosure movement did was bring back the concept of the Roman dominos. That simply means absolute exclusive ownership. It established absolute authority over a piece of earth. You were the sole decision maker.
I completely understand the economic bottleneck you are describing, but I come at it from a different way. We need to look closely at the video's use of the phrase true freedom.
Okay, let's look at it.
In the video, we hear the line, no more vague or shared rights. But what exactly does vague mean in this context? Because what a modern economist might call a vague legal right, a 16th century farmer relied on for their literal daily survival.
You mean things like gathering wood?
Exactly. The right to gather peat for a fire in winter, or the right to let your single cow eat grass on the village common, that was the difference between feeding your family and starving.
I hear that, but
So when we talk about exclusive ownership, we have to admit it didn't mean freedom for everyone. It meant freedom for a few landowners, which fundamentally changes how we should view the resulting wealthy state.
think about what that exclusive ownership actually unlocked. Without clear ownership,
People have zero motivation to invest their own time and money into improving their environment. Let me give you an analogy.
Sure, go ahead.
If you share a bicycle with the whole neighborhood, no one really wants to pay out of pocket to fix a flat tire, right? But if you own the bicycle, you keep it in perfect condition. The video points out a massive realization. It says, they realized true freedom is the only path to a wealthy state.
I hear your bicycle analogy, but I have to push back. That analogy just doesn't work for land. What happens to the neighbors who now have to walk? Taking away the shared bicycle creates a wealthy state on paper, but it leaves many individuals poorer.
Well, let's look at the mechanics of this then. Before Enclosure, that land was what the video calls dead capital.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The term dead capital is fascinating, but it is heavily loaded.
How is it loaded?
It is a phrase used by the winners of history. It assumes that if a piece of land isn't producing maximum financial profit for a business, it is somehow dead. But that land was very much alive.
Sure, it had grass and trees.
And people. It was actively supporting entire communities of farmers, weavers, and families. They were gathering resources, fishing in streams, and living sustainably, even if they weren't getting rich.
I hear you, but let's look at it from a purely mechanical, financial perspective. Think of dead capital like having $1 million locked inside a heavy steel safe.
Okay, a safe.
Yeah, but you don't have the combination. The money is physically there. The potential is there. But you can't spend it, you can't invest it, and you can't use it to build anything new. The soil of England was that safe.
And the combination?
The legal title, the piece of paper proving absolute ownership, was the combination. When the fences went up and the legal certainty of ownership was enforced, that dead capital suddenly became liquid wealth.
Right, because of credit.
Exactly. Because if you own the land outright, you don't just have a place to grow turnips. You have collateral. You can take that deed to a bank in London and say, I own this land free and clear. Loan me money against it.
Which you could not do when the land was shared by 50 villagers.
Precisely. By creating exclusive ownership, landlords could suddenly borrow money to buy better plows, dig irrigation canals, and breed better sheep. That is how the land was resurrected into productive, surging wealth.
You are absolutely right about the financial mechanism. Having a clear deed allowed landlords to turn dirt into credit. I don't dispute the math.
But you dispute the result.
I dispute the human reality of how that combination to the safe was acquired. When the legal certainty of ownership was enforced by the government, it didn't magically create new soil. It took the wealth that was previously sustaining the many and transferred it into the hands of a single Dominus.
It consolidated it, yes.
The land became a factory for profit, yes, but calling the previous way of life dead capital kind of erases the humanity of the thousands of people who depended on it.
But you cannot deny the macro results. The total amount of food produced in Britain skyrocketed. The agricultural revolution meant fewer people could grow way more food, and that surplus is what allowed the nation's wealth to grow immensely.
Right. Fewer people were needed to grow the food. But we have to ask, what happened to the people who are no longer needed? What happened to the villagers who were locked out of the safe?
Well, historically, they moved to the towns and cities. They found new ways to contribute to society, which actually provided the exact labor force needed to spark the Industrial Revolution.
Found new ways to contribute is a very polite way of saying they were evicted. They were forced to find wage labor to avoid starving in the streets.
They found jobs in the new industries.
They poured into cities that weren't ready for them. They became the cheap labor that worked in the new factories and shipyards.
Which actually brings me to a point where I want to admit a bit of historical confusion. Or at least I want to explore the connective tissue here with you.
Sure, what is the confusion?
I understand how putting a fence around a sheep pasture in England increased crop yields and unlocked financial credit. But the second half of the thesis in the video designed by Hot makes a massive leap.
The leap across the ocean.
Exactly. It argues that this mindset of legal certainty inspired the Age of Discovery in the British Empire. I am struggling to see how a domestic farming policy directly translates to building massive ships and colonizing continents. What is the actual mechanism there?
That is the perfect question, because the mechanism is twofold. It is about capital and it is about labor. Let's start with the capital.
The money from the safe?
Right. As you pointed out with your safe analogy,
these new landowners suddenly had access to massive amounts of credit and cash. Once they improved their farms, they had surplus wealth. They needed a place to invest that money to make even more money.
Ah, so they looked outward?
Exactly. That naturally pushed their gaze outward, toward the ocean. They started using the wealth generated from the enclosed land to fund extremely expensive overseas trading companies or to finance colonial expeditions.
So the enclosed land literally paid for the ships? The farm was the collateral for the empire?
Yes. But the second part of the mechanism is the labor. Who is physically building these ships? Who is taking the massive risk of sailing across a terrifying ocean to an unknown land?
The people who moved to the cities.
Exactly. It was largely the very people who had been displaced by Enclosure.
And this is where the legal framework of the British system becomes so crucial. I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the ideas by Hut highlighted in the video perfectly capture the psychological shift this created.
A psychological shift?
Yes. The video says, then a bold declaration was made to those facing the horizon, cross the vast oceans, over there the title of Dominus awaits.
Right. The promise of ownership.
Knowing that you could truly own your path is what built the empire. It was built, as the video states, on the rock of unbreakable title.
But let's look at the motivation of those people looking at the horizon. The video says the brave boarded the ships ready to carve out their own destiny. We have to ask a very critical question here.
Which is?
Were those people crossing the dangerous oceans solely because they were brave and seeking the grand title of Dominus? Or did they have to cross the ocean because the Enclosure movement took away their ability to survive at home?
You are saying it was purely push factors.
I am saying you cannot separate the two. If you are a farmer whose shared grazing field was just fenced off by a wealthy lord, you don't have a way to feed your family anymore.
That is true. The cities were tough.
The cities are crowded, dirty, and full of disease. So when a ship captain offers you passage to a new world in exchange for years of labor, you take it. The unbreakable title might have been a tool of pure necessity, born out of desperation rather than just heroic inspiration.
I see the logic there, but that assumes desperation was unique to Britain. Poverty and desperation have existed in every country throughout human history, you know?
Of course.
Every European nation in the 16th and 17th centuries had poor, displaced farmers. France had poor peasants. Spain had poor peasants. So what made Britain different? Why did Britain leap from enclosure to a global empire, while others took different paths?
Well, how would you answer that?
It goes right back to the legal framework, the promise of the unbreakable title. If you were just desperate, you might run away to the next town.
True.
But if you have the promise of an unbreakable title, a legal guarantee that if you cross the ocean, work hard, and claim a piece of land, the highest laws of the British government will protect your ownership. That gives you the confidence to build an empire.
You become the owner.
Exactly. You aren't just the subject of a king who can take your land whenever he feels like it. You are a dominus. That legal certainty is what drove the massive wave of private colonization.
I agree that the legal framework of the unbreakable title was uniquely powerful. It absolutely fueled the expansion. But we cannot separate the engine of that expansion from the fuel it burned.
Meaning the people.
Yes. When we talk about how the brave boarded the ships, I am simply pointing out that bravery and desperation often walk hand in hand. The title of absolute owner was deeply appealing to someone who had just lost their shared rights to a wealthy lord back in England.
They wanted to be the lord.
Precisely. They wanted to become the lord themselves in a new land.
Which actually highlights the brilliance of the system, even if the transition was incredibly harsh. The concept of the Dominus created a ladder.
A ladder of mobility?
Yes. Before this, under the feudal system or the shared commons, you were just born into a village and you shared the mud with everyone else forever. There was no upward mobility.
That is generally true for the medieval period, yes.
Once absolute property rights were established, a person could look across the ocean and say, I can acquire a title, I can become an owner, I can build generational wealth. That is a massive leap forward for human motivation.
It certainly motivated people to move.
It took the vague, blurry lines of the past and drew sharp, clear lines of opportunity.
But we have to remember where those sharp, clear lines were drawn. They were drawn right through the middle of existing communities, both in Britain and eventually across the globe.
How so?
The concept of true freedom really is the pivot point of this whole debate. For the person holding the title, holding the piece of paper that says, "This is mine," it absolutely feels like true freedom.
Naturally.
But for the person standing on the outside of the fence, looking at the apple tree they used to pick from, the new rules feel like a cage.
And you are suggesting they took that exact model overseas.
Exactly. The Age of Discovery spread this specific model of ownership across the world. The British Empire literally exported the fence.
They brought the Dominus concept with them.
Yes, they exported the idea of the unbreakable title to lands in North America, Africa, and Australia. Lands that, in many cases, already had indigenous people living on them with their own complex systems of shared rights.
Right, different systems of ownership.
The British arrived, looked at land that wasn't fenced in or farmed in the European style, and declared it vague or dead capital. Just like they did back home.
Because without that clear legal framework, the land wasn't being utilized to its maximum economic potential. Wherever that concept of the unbreakable title went, modern economic development followed.
Development for who, though?
Well, the ability to trust that your property will not be taken away arbitrarily by a dictator or a rival village is the foundation of all modern prosperity. If you cannot secure what you build, you will not build anything at all.
I understand the economic theory behind it.
The video makes this incredibly clear. By moving away from confusing rules to absolute ownership, dead capital came alive. The modern world was built on those fences.
It built the modern economic world, yes. But it is vital to recognize that this transition required actively dismantling older, more community-focused ways of living. The wealth was created by exclusion.
I think we've really drilled down into the core mechanisms here, from the soil of an English pasture to the shipyards of London and across the oceans. Let's start moving toward our conclusion and summarize where we both stand on this deeply historical issue.
I think that is a good idea.
Let me clearly recap my side of the discussion. I maintain that the video designed by Hot correctly identifies absolute property rights, specifically the Enclosure movement, as the true engine of British history.
Right.
Before clear rules were established, the land was trapped in a tragedy of the commons, unable to reach its potential. By establishing the Reborn Roman Dominus, clear rules and unbreakable titles turned barren, underused land into productive, liquid wealth.
That is your core thesis.
Yes, this economic certainty provided the capital to fund ships and the legal framework that gave ordinary people the confidence to cross vast oceans. The promise that you could permanently own what you improve is the spark that built the British Empire and ultimately the modern economy.
And to clearly recap my side, I acknowledge the massive economic power of property rights. Turning land into capital undeniably funded global expansion. However, my warning is that we must remember the human cost.
The cost of the fences.
Exactly. Exclusive ownership fundamentally meant taking away shared rights from the common people. The lands were not dead. They were the lifelines of thousands of families.
I see.
Brave boarded the ships to build an empire. We must recognize that these people were often the very ones displaced by this new definition of true freedom. The immense wealth of the empire relied heavily on the desperation of those forced out by the fences.
Both of these perspectives show just how deeply thought-provoking the British leap from enclosure to empire truly is.
Oh, absolutely.
The historical ideas by Hut give us a perfect lens to look at history not just as a series of dates, but as a series of changing rules. It forces us to ask what creates wealth, what creates freedom, and what the long-term consequences of those creations are.
It really does. It takes a historical event that might seem dry, like agricultural reform, and shows us the hidden mechanics underneath it.
It's fascinating.
It is a fantastic starting point for anyone wanting to understand why the economic world looks the way it does today.
Well, we aren't going to declare a winner today. History is too vast and too complex for simple victories. We leave the final judgment up to you, our listener. We highly encourage you to keep exploring the history of property rights, the Age of Discovery, and how the legal foundations of the past shape your everyday life right now.
Keep questioning the history you read.
Always look at the mechanisms behind the wealth, and always ask what was gained and what was lost.
Think back to that simple wooden fence we talked about at the very beginning of the show. The next time you walk past a fence in your neighborhood, ask yourself, is this fence here to protect the wealth growing inside it, or is it here to push people away toward the horizon? Thank you for joining us on The Debate.